Hey everyone, you are listening to the Self-Awareness Journey podcast. This little banter is about a car ride long and features your hosts, JJ Parker and Melissa Albers. JJ owns a tech company and Melissa has been a coach working with influencers for the last 18 years. JJ, as you know, this week we completed a workshop on introversion and extroversion and knowing your style. And wasn't that so much fun? We had
it was great.
Over 50 people, right? And it was just a really cool, event. And I think it'd be kind of cool for us to talk about that today on our podcast and do sort of a abbreviated version, like kind of talk about what we learned. Yeah.
Well, I would say that one of our favorite topics between the two of us is talking about introversion and extroversion.
Yes.
Because we're both on one. The listeners can guess who's who. You'll find out shortly. But I love this topic because it is one of those things that some people might know about themselves, and they probably have an inkling anyway. Mm-hmm. But I find it's one of the more obvious or out there personality traits. Like when an introvert meets an extrovert, it's almost like sometimes you're meeting someone from Mars. You can't even understand, like why they're acting the way they are, and vice versa, right? And it can lead to misunderstanding, but in some ways it can lead to like really great relationships. So.
Well, and I think too that so often when people are talking about introversion and extroversion, I mean, there's millions of books and workshops and stuff out on this topic, but I like the angle that we're talking about this because it isn't just how you are on the outside, like showing up in that way, like letting people know you're introverted or extroverted. It really is talking about how after conversations you feel inside. If a discussion or interaction with someone went well or if it didn't go well. The differences with introversion and extroversion are wildly big, right? The differences inside how you feel, how you process all of that, and then how those feelings sit inside of you and then come out later. So I think that's really great. So let's just get started.
Let's jump in just to give some baseline on introverts and extroverts. And I'll say for me, learning about like my own style has had like a huge impact, both personally in my personal relationships, and at work. Like, once I started talking about my introverted traits with my colleagues, like work got so much better for me.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And we'll talk about that a little later.
So we started, and I think this would be a really good place for us to start today. What are there are some primary markers that we can help identify. So you want to start with the introversion markers?
As an introvert, I have lots of experience with this part. So the first one we talk about is energy, right? Like where do introverts get their energy from? Like what kind of recharges them, right? And for us introverts, oftentimes it's spending time alone, right? Being alone recharges us. A lot of times, like for me, like I like to eat alone, right? Sometimes I'll be eating at work alone and basically hoping the whole time no one comes and sits down next to me and starts chit-chatting because I'm like trying to recharge for my next meeting, right? Whereas an extrovert might look at that and be like, oh, poor JJ is eating alone, right?
I'll go sit by him.
Yeah, because I'm like, oh, don't sit by me. And even things like traveling alone. I really enjoy traveling alone. I actually like traveling alone so much that I had an admin years back, and when we would go travel for work, like as a sales team, she'd book me on a different flight from the team.
Wow.
What a sweetheart. Yeah. It was awesome. And then with work, often I like to work independently, right? That doesn't mean that I can't function in a team or a group setting.
Right.
But when it really comes down to like, okay, I need to really produce some of my best content or output, I like to do it independently by myself. I don't like to have to try to interact with other people to get the work done, right? And then, you know, kind of going back to that being alone thing, just like sitting quietly and thinking, right? Like just this whole idea that like the calmness and the solitude recharge, right?
Yeah.
So next, that kind of like dovetails into how introverts interact with people.
Yeah.
Right? There is a big myth. I want to bust a myth right now. Introverts don't hate people. We're not necessarily like haters of people, right? I like people, but as an introvert, I just don't really get a lot of energy from big groups, right? Like Melissa, when you and I talk, I love it. One-on-one, awesome, right? I'd much rather go have coffee with one person than do the whole like, hey, let's get a group of 12 people and go to dinner, right? So I like to interact with people on a smaller scale. And when it comes to communication style, right, a lot of times I prefer written, right? I'd rather have a text or an email than a phone conversation. Obviously, texting over the past, whatever decade since it's gotten invented, has been awesome for us introverts. This one I introvert so hard on sometimes that I actually changed my work voicemail to say, "You've reached the desk of JJ. Please send me an email."
I thought you
and then I just never answer the phone.
I thought you had that just to me.
No.
So I really like what you're talking about with how you're getting your energy, and then that second marker of how you interact.
How we're interacting, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you respond if something in that interaction doesn't go well for you? Like, what's that like for an introversion side?
Well, so like when you're introverted, right, you're generally a little bit more reserved, I would say. And I don't want to stereotype all introverts, but generally it's like a little bit more reserved. And the other thing about introverts is that we have to think in order to talk, right? So you actually probably even hear it in my cadence a lot, even on the podcast, where like I'll put more pauses between things because I'm actually trying to think it through quick before it comes out of my mouth. Now, when we're in like a group setting, it's hard or harder for me to engage a lot of times because people will be like talk, right? And I'm just like trying to process, trying to think, right? Like things aren't actually coming out of my mouth very fast. So I actually a lot of times feel like I'm not able to share my opinion. I'm not able to get in the conversation, or I won't feel like heard, right? Or
Sure.
And it almost goes down to like a respect thing. Like, why do these people not stop talking so I can add my piece to this conversation, right?
Yep, that's interesting.
So that actually turns into almost like a disengagement, right? Like I'll easily get disengaged in a conversation if I if I'm not really like allowed space into it. And because of my more passive nature, I'm not going to really insert myself into that. I feel uncomfortable just inserting myself into a conversation.
Right.
Even though that'd be like very natural for other personality types.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other sort of feeling, did you have a specific?
No, I was just going to comment on that. I like that because I think there, as we just reflect, and people that are introverts listening to this call, it would be really interesting to have them sit on this for just a moment. Like, when their needs aren't being met in a conversation or an interaction, is that the experience that they also have? Is that sort of pulling in, pulling back, becoming even more quiet or more introspective? That's really interesting.
The other thing that will happen with me, especially when it starts getting into these like bigger group settings, right? Because if you're like running with a more extroverted crowd, you know, it's a lot like, hey, let's all go do this and like pumping up the energy and all of that, when I want to kind of go the opposite way. So it makes me sometimes feel like a misfit. Like I don't quite fit in with the group. And it causes like even a little bit of insecurity, right? Like why don't I get excited to go out to dinner with everybody?
Am I so different?
You know? Yeah. Right?
So I think that's really, really critical feedback. I think that's such good feedback. And I would ask you, as you're sitting in this space right now and you're having these feelings as an introvert when interactions are feeling hard for you, what kind of vibe are you kicking off? Like, are you aware of what sort of physical or external vibe you're kicking off in those moments when your feelings are like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because like at first, I didn't really realize, you know, years ago, I didn't really realize I was like kicking out that vibe, right? I actually had one of our old sales managers, once, we were having, I don't know exactly what was going on, but I remember like he made a comment about like me being arrogant. Oh. Right? I was like, what on earth is he talking about? Like, I don't feel like I'm arrogant at all. And actually what he was misreading was me being quiet was he was interpreting that or perceiving that as like me being kind of like smug or arrogant and not even, you know, like recognizing him. So obviously his needs weren't getting met. But I didn't realize I was putting out that kind of vibe, right? It wasn't until I learned about the other side of the coin, the extroverted side, which made me realize like, oh, I need to interact with an extrovert differently, or else I'm going to give off this weird vibe, right? Yeah. But when I'm really not, like when I'm feeling like I'm not being heard or I'm really overwhelmed by the group, I will definitely just become disengaged, right? Either just physically disengaged, like straight up leave, or just like emotionally disengaged, right? Yeah. It's like we'll stop caring or trying, right? Yeah. I might get like short with people or a little bit flippant. Right? Yeah. Yeah, that's really, and I see this piece right here is the piece that I'm really interested in as we're talking about communication styles, because we so often talk about all these external things that we can, you know, take tests and everything to say which one we are, but seldom do we go into this level where it's like, how does it actually affect us and how does it affect the people that we're interacting with? So is it okay if I switch over to the... Oh yeah, I was just going to say one other like key work tip on that one. Yeah. Is for me as an probably detailed introvert, in work situations, if I don't feel like I'm being heard or my opinions, I will go into like technical detail, right? I'll lean on expertise, right? I'll kind of like, and it's a weird act out, right? Like where I just kind of like steamroller people with like how much I know about like computer software or something. Like it's stupid. Like, but it's clearly like I'm not being heard, so I want to somehow get in there, and that's how I do it. I bet other people can recognize that behavior because I see it in the other introverts too, you know? Yeah, yeah. Oftentimes, just in my work with introverts, that's exactly a marker is that they don't feel comfortable speaking on a lot of generic things, but they'll usually feel comfortable on whatever their expertise is. So they'll add to it in that way. So that's pretty normal, actually. It's interesting. All right, enough about introverts. We already got too much attention and we're uncomfortable. Go. Let's do some contrast. Go extrovert. Woohoo! Let me just get my party hat out. So let's contrast. So the first thing that you talked about with introversion is where you get your energy from, and extroverts. And I'm going to use, and we kind of are using some more expanded examples.
And I want to make sure that we say, again, you already did once, but this doesn't mean that you're all of these things if you're an introvert or all of these things if you're an extrovert. These are, we use expanded examples because I think it's easier to understand. I think a lot of energy for extroverts comes from people activities, being around people, communicating, talking. You know, you use that phrase, you have to think to talk, and extroverts have to talk to think.
Yep.
So they may not know a decision and they just want to riff on it and blah, 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 go back and forth. And that juices them up and makes them feel, you know, really excited. And a lot of energy, even for me, I really enjoy being with people, you know, like being able to just talk about a feeling or talk about something. And I love that feeling of everybody laughing and engaging. You know, I really love that, that energy. And interacting with people, I much prefer face-to-face interactions. It's a more immediate, a lot of extroverts are very empathetic, very empathic. So they're picking up on the vibes of people to choose how to understand the group or to choose how to interact, is they want to pick up on the vibes of everybody around them. So obviously face-to-face interactions or being in person is much easier and the easiest for extroverts, which, you know, talk about the pandemic in this last year. It's been really challenging for a lot of people. The other way, if you can't do it face to face, it's like, I love just getting on the phone. Like, let's just talk it through, you know, and email would be my least interesting way to interact, unless there's details, of course, but just generally speaking about the interaction piece, it's like that part feels like I don't get to pick up on people's vibes. It's really hard to read energy from an email. Sometimes it's hard. And it's just so much easier with the people side. So I would definitely say the interacting with people is much more of that sharing energy so that you can really kind of get a read on folks.
So like when, let me ask you, so when you're not interacting in the way that you prefer, how does that affect?
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
That's a great question. It's really funny because extroversion is so much about weighing in on other people's energies and participating that way. If the interaction doesn't have good energy, like if there's discord in the group or if there's an introvert in the group that me as an extrovert senses is not feeling good, it's very common for me to amp up my extroversion to try to make it better. So, and you'll see this a lot with extroversion where extroverts will try to carry the room. They will see that something's not quite right. They'll feel that people aren't quite getting where they need to be, and they will jump in and try to make it better. They take it on as a personal responsibility.
Here's a tip for all you extroverts that doesn't help.
And again, this isn't in the awareness piece. This is just our natural need to make everybody feel good. You know, extroverts want everybody to feel good and at their own expense. So a lot of times extroverts, especially when they're not, very aware, extroverts will absolutely overblow a situation. They'll, just do things that are uncomfortable because they are feeling so uncomfortable and they don't know what else to do. So it's almost like a reaction. So that's kind of what happens is that person goes into overdrive, becomes more extroverted, talks more, tells jokes,
Yeah, like I describe it as like they become like a caricature of themselves.
Yeah.
Right? It's like everything's a little expanded.
Yeah, exactly. And they think they're being helpful. So it actually oftentimes looks like they're really seeking more energy. It's like they're seeking attention. But it usually isn't as much that as the person just doesn't want to feel uncomfortable. So they think that by acting that way that they will make it less uncomfortable. But that doesn't actually happen that way. It usually makes it a little more uncomfortable. So it's sort of a cycle.
Yeah.
But for me, like, that's what I would say is, especially before I did much of this work, I would break out in a sweat if I felt like something wasn't going well in a meeting, or even if I was just talking with a person and I felt that that person was starting to go a little sideways or wasn't in agreement with me or didn't like something, I would want to just make everything okay. Like, oh, what do I need to do? I'll shift it up. I can do anything to make this okay. When I didn't need to take on that type of obligation and duty at all.
Yeah, like you're trying to take that responsibility on yourself, and then you felt like you were like failing if everyone isn't having a good time.
Yep, exactly. And
right?
so yeah, and it is so much, extroverts take on so much more obligation and duty in interactions than they need to, but that's their natural way. Instead of how the introvert pulls back, the extrovert leans in. So it just creates more of a wobble.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's funny because when that starts to happen, another marker that we talked about is kind of what happens on the inside. And I was sort of alluding to some of it, like the activity that happens, but what happens on the inside is oftentimes in situations where something isn't going right, I feel like I need to pretend like it's okay. Like I feel like I need to pretend that it's okay, and act more bright or act more, relaxed, like force a sort of a sense of relaxing, and so my feelings are really wonky inside. Like I'm not doing a good job. I'm not good enough to fix this. It's my responsibility because everybody else is so much quieter. Like these are the feelings that will often happen inside of extroverts when things aren't feeling very good. And it's interesting how those feelings like sit with you long after that exchange. It's like, why can't I just notice everybody? What did I do wrong? Why didn't I change something in that room? Because I sensed that the room wasn't right before anybody else did. And the feeling in there is, the sensing is probably true. Like they probably were picking up on a lot of those cues way before other people were. But where it went sideways was the level of responsibility about what to do with those cues.
Yeah.
So then that feeling of, I didn't do this right, I could have done this, why don't I ever, and then sort of those feelings inside create this insecurity, like this really deep insecurity. So you talked about introversion insecurity. I would say this is what the extroversions is. And that final marker is, and I asked you that question, what are the cues that you emit?
Yeah, like what vibe are you putting out?
Yeah. And I think extroversion vibes come out like, hey, notice me. I'm here. I can fix this. I'm the class clown. I'm the team leader. Let's rally, this battle cry to force things to be more what it should be, air quotes. So like putting on that actor, we talk about that is like trying to be the actor, make everything okay. And those I think are the vibes that kick off. And for other people in the room, it's like, oh man, that just like, that's so strong. But extroverts don't recognize that those are the vibes that they're kicking off.
Right.
But it creates more of that discord almost.
Yeah. It's like introvert repellent.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about this like I told this story on the workshop about how at my company we exhibit at this trade show called NAB, National Association of Broadcasters. There's like a huge thing in Las Vegas, right? It's 100,000 people gather. The trade show, like our typical day is like a 10-hour long interacting with customers on the show floor, and then we like grab a happy hour drink on our way to our hotel, and we change our clothes, and then we're whisked off to dinner with customers, and then after that, like the crew wants to meet up for a karaoke, right? Yeah. And we do this for 4 nights in a row, and to you, you're probably like, this sounds amazing.
That actually sounds
let's
tiring.
Go.
That sounds hard.
But for me is like a nightmare. Like it was just a nightmare for years and years.
Yeah.
And I never really understood why my team loved this environment and like I just had a bad time like the whole week, right? And it was really like it really started to impact my job. I mean, like sometimes I would just not show up for stuff, which was not super professional. Or I'd be out with the sales team and a client for dinner, and I'd just be super quiet and reclusive, right? So they're like, oh, something's wrong with him. And I'd just generally be grumpy, like the whole show. So like I felt really guilty about that, right? I felt like I didn't fit in with my own team. I mean, I was embarrassed by the way I would behave, right? Yeah. And the ultimate feeling was like I didn't really feel like I was fit to be the CEO of my own company.
Wow.
Right? I just like felt like such an imposter. Right? And you see these like glamorized, like, oh, look at that guy's a tech CEO, and they're like up on stage, they're doing the thing. It's like, God, that's just not me. Like, that's not me. Maybe I'm not fit, right? And it wasn't until I started learning, and you and I started talking about personality traits, and I started understanding my own wiring.
Yeah.
Right? And realizing like it's okay to be an introvert, right? And
yeah.
And it's okay to be uncomfortable in these situations. And I realized that being an introvert brings me certain superpowers as the CEO of my company that maybe an extrovert wouldn't have, right?
Yeah.
So today, like I'll still go do the trade show stuff, right? But I do it differently now that I know like where I get my energy, how I interact with people best, right? So that just means like, you know, I put a little bit more time between like the show floor and the dinner, and I maybe skip that happy hour, right? My team knows that I need this recharge time, and talking about how I need it, right? And talking about how my brain's wired versus how their brain's wired, and these just natural things, is awesome because they're super supportive, right? And like for the first time in those situations, like they'll even call out like, hey, JJ, we're going to go do this. You go back to the hotel. We'll meet up with you later. They just kind of like, it all just works out, and it feels so much better. Feels so much better. I'm so much more effective during that week. And I feel so supported by the team, and it's great.
Wow, so you're just saying like just by being a little more aware and then being able to articulate what you're learning about yourself to other people around you has made everything so much better. Well,
yeah, like before I was like guilty, embarrassed. I thought I was like a misfit and like literally an imposter in my own role. And after being more aware of it, like I feel confident, understood, and super effective and way happier.
Yeah. I think we are running out of time, unfortunately.
Oh, no. How can we be running out of time already? We hardly even got into this topic. Why do you say that?
I know it. I think what would be really cool is if, you know, we've both been on this journey for a while, and we did pay attention to certain key things about ourselves as we started to learn, right? And get over some of these feelings of insecurities and not really feeling really good in certain spots. And I think maybe we could leave the listeners with some of the key things to understand in your own interactions so that they can start to identify and begin to build on that self-awareness that they're already gaining, right, from listening to stuff like this.
Right. So we talk about a lot like, hey, you can sense it in your body before maybe you realize it in your head, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I can tell you that trade shows scenario, at like 5 o'clock when that show was about to end, I would literally start shaking.
Wow.
Right? And I didn't know why. I just thought like, oh, why did they turn the air conditioner down right at the end of the show or something? Like I thought it was like literally getting colder. But no, it was like I was having like anxiety about how I knew I was getting no break for the next, entire night.
Yeah. So body cues, like on that negative side that you had that experience. There's like stomach aches, like getting a stress headache, or for me, what happens is my throat starts to feel like it's closing shut. Like I start feeling like almost like my voice is being cut off, which is, in direct opposition with an extrovert, right? So I think that's like a response. But there's also like great body cues that tell you when things are going really well for you. Like you just feel good. Everything feels light.
Things are much lighter.
Happy.
Yeah.
You can feel your face is relaxed. You're smiling and it's just easier. So body cues is a really, really big one. I think too, like we've talked a lot in this pod about our thinking, like what's happening inside, right? The habits that we keep thinking. And you were talking a lot about beating yourself up, like feeling really guilty. And I think that's like I also used in the exact opposite example, feeling really guilty. So you pulled back and felt guilty, and I, as an extrovert, felt guilty leaning too far in. So that story that we're telling ourselves that we're wrong or that there's something wrong with us, and catching ourselves and thinking about what we're, realizing what we're thinking about.
Yeah, that judgment. When you have that judgment and then it turns into a story you keep telling yourself over and over, you sort of keep doing that thing, right?
Yes.
So just don't be so hard on yourself. Just recognize it and then just, try to move on from it, right?
Yeah, because then like the last thing I would add in this is like that all of those thinking patterns in the moment of making yourself feel wrong and making yourself feel guilty, then it actually stays in your system. It stays in your system for a long time. And the question I would ask you is, do you recognize when you have that stuff sitting in there? Like, how long does it have to be in there before you realize that it's there and really bothering you? Like, just starting to build that awareness. And it takes some time and it takes some practice and it takes consistency to have the awareness of these things. So, after a pod, I'm sure people are like, oh, that was interesting. And 7 minutes later, they're on to the next thing. But I would really be encouraging about getting in some sort of little practice to just check in with, check in with
How
yourself.
many times do we say that? Check in with yourself. Take some time to check in with yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation and the workshop was great. We'll be running that workshop again. I would really encourage people to hop in if they see that we're advertising for that.
Check it out on the website.
We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. Our mission is to help people become happier and more effective by gaining insight into their own thoughts and feelings. We'd love your support. First, share this podcast with anyone you think might enjoy it. Second, leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast site. This helps others discover the podcast so we can reach more people. And third, sign up for our newsletter at theselfawarenessjourney.com. This will help us communicate better with you and build our community. Thank you so much for joining us in the Self-Awareness Journey. We'll see you next week.